This episode of A Gentleman's Motor Racing Diary, Ferrari and Surtees continue in winning form at Monza in the Italian Grand Prix. And then we move on into 1965 with the French Grand Prix from the Mini Nürburgring at Clermont-Ferrand. With Formula One still at 1.5 litres, big banger sports cars satisfy that urge for power as they come to Silverstone for the Martini Trophy. Our film is the home movie record and diary of the late John Tate, whose words are spoken by his son Christopher.
Early in September 1964, ourselves and about 100,000 Italians converged on Monza for the 35th Italian Grand Prix. The Japanese Honda team was making only its second appearance, with the Californian Ronnie Bucknam driving. The Coppa Inter Europa GT race featured several Ferrari 275 LMs. Number 41 was Colonel Ronnie Hawes' Maranello Concessionaire's car from Britain. During the lunch interval, there was a demonstration by some American dragsters doing standing start quarter-mile runs down the main straight. They looked pretty silly to me, not racing cars at all. The now retired Sterling Moss was present, and I don't expect he had much time for the sprint cars either. Big Dan Gurney had seen it all before. Sterling had now turned his hand to broadcasting with ABC, joined by Chris Economaki, and he was interviewing Jim Clark, who better qualified, the past master interviewing the current fastest driver. Joe Bonnier was still driving for Rob Walker, and they had switched from Cooper chassis to a Brabham. After trying BRM engines, they'd now also reverted to Coventry Climax. Graham Hill had again won the season opener at Monaco, and since then Gurney, Surtees and Bandini had a win apiece. But it was Clark who was again proving the class of the field with 3 victories to his name. The Honda has a semi-monocoque chassis and a transversely mounted twin overhead cam V12, reputed to be pushing out 225 horsepower. Sterling, now assuming the role of film director, sent his cameraman off to get a good shot of the new contender from the land of the rising sun. Clark and Chapman get ready for action, and the Brabham BT11, painted in Rob Walker's colours, was a straightforward development of the BT7. Ferrari were concentrating their efforts on engine development. There was the older V6 and the V8, which had taken its debut win at Syracuse. In practice here, the team had tried a new flat 12 engine. Jack Brabham and engineer Ron Turanak were inspecting the Honda. Innes Ireland was chatting to famous jazzman Chris Barber, but Sterling's company looked much more engaging. Whilst John Cooper socialised with Gerald Lascelles, Colin Chapman lurked in the background, on one of his spying missions, no doubt. Lorenzo Bandini had taken the sensible precaution of putting a plaster across his nose. Maurice Trintignant was making his 82nd and last Grand Prix start in a BRM V8. Innes Ireland and Trevor Taylor are now both ex-Works Lotus drivers, driving the BRP BRMs. The front row consists of Gurney, Surtees and Hill, with Clark and McLaren on the second row. The cars rolled forward from the dummy grid to take their starting places. But when the flag dropped, Graham Hill had been left on the line as his clutch failed. Gurney took an early lead from Surtees, with McLaren and Clark nose to tail behind him. Behind them there was a stream of 12 further cars. The lead 4 cars of Surtees, Gurney, McLaren and Clark continually swapped places for the first 25 laps. Clark and McLaren only managed to stay in touch by hard driving and clever slipstreaming. McLaren later began to drop back, and Clark retired with a broken piston. When Gurney's car started misfiring, Surtees opened up a commanding lead. Joe Bonnier in the Walker-Brabham Climax ran on to a steady 12th place. And so Surtees took his second win of the season, and McLaren brought the Cooper Climax home in second. Over the line, it looked like a dead heat for third place, Bandini's Ferrari just beating Ginther's BRM. And further down the field, Baghetti's red BRM just pipped Scarfiotti's Ferrari. Enthusiastic as ever, the Italian crowd swarmed onto the circuit. The tired-looking John Surtees was escorted towards the winner's enclosure. Surtees took second place in the two remaining races of the year, just to give him the 1964 championship by a single point from Graham Hill. Clark had a poor end to the season, with only 2 points in the last 5 races. The 1965 Grand Prix season had started well. Jim Clark had won in South Africa and then taken his 4th successive victory at Spa. Graham Hill had won at Monaco for the 3rd successive year. Like the British, the French seemed unable to decide where to hold their Grand Prix, and for 1965 had chosen Clermont-Ferrand in the Auvergne, some 50 miles southwest of Lyon. A memorial to the French driver Louis Rosier, who died in '56 after rolling his Ferrari at Montlhéry, overlooks this circuit. Honda had acquired the services of Richie Ginther from BRM to drive alongside Ronnie Buckner. The Cooper team had again replaced their number 2 driver. This year, the young Austrian Jochen Rindt was given his chance. Bandini was driving the flat 12 Ferrari, while Surtees remained with the V8. The circuit was only built in 1958 and had never been used for a Grand Prix before. Few of the drivers knew their way around the course. Rob Walker had entered Joe Bonnier and Joe Siffert, both in Brabhams. Bonnier's car had a Climax engine, but Siffert the BRM. Graham Hill had a nasty shunt on Friday when the throttles on his BRM jammed open. He was obviously shaken, and his Saturday times were slow. The Hondas were improving rapidly and were now not far off the pace. Jim Clark was fastest on this second day of practice and had time to give teammate Mike Spence a lift back to the pits. New BRM driver, another Scot, Jackie Stewart, was second fastest. In his 3 Grand Prix to date, he has finished 6th, 3rd and 2nd. It is clear that Stewart is a very considerable talent. On race day morning, the Formula 3 race was won by the American Tommy Hitchcock in a Brabham, defeating a mass of French entrants. The 8-kilometre circuit of the Auvergne is something of a mini Nürburgring, set in the hills near the village of Charade, above Clermont-Ferrand. It is almost devoid of straights. Whilst the circuit is highly regarded, the facilities are a little basic. The paddock was far too small for the Grand Prix circus, and all set on the hillside, it all looked a little provincial. Jim Clark's girlfriend, Sally Stokes, with Betty Hill and Marianne Bonnier, enjoyed watching their men race. Dennis Jenkinson and Michael T., both from Britain's Motorsport magazine, are well-established members of the Grand Prix scene. Raymond Mays, first of ERA and now BRM fame. And the owner of the soft drink is Joe Siffert, racing now for Rob Walker. Graham Hill talked with journalist and photographer Bill Gavin. Cooper's had a new racing manager in the form of Roy Salvadori, who brought his many years of knowledge and experience to the team. His drivers were Kiwi Bruce McLaren from Auckland and the promising young Austrian Jochen Rindt. Dunlop technician Vic Barlow checked the tyre wear on one of the Ferraris. Whilst the Michelin men toured the circuit, even though Michelin don't produce racing tyres, this is their local town. In the paddock, the Cooper team were working on Rint's car. Even Roy Salvadori was getting his hands dirty. Colin Chapman looked confident, but Jim Clark had reliability problems in both days of practice. The new 32-valve Coventry Climax V8 was proving susceptible to blowing up or leaking oil. Clark would revert to the old car and engine for the race. Joe Bonnier and Joe Siffert walked through the paddock. This is Siffert's first full season in Grand Prix racing, with the spectacular third place last year at Watkins Glen. Denny Hume's partner at Brabham was the experienced Dan Gurney. Ronnie Bucknam was almost 5 seconds off the pace of his teammate Richie Ginther, the crew cut Ginther being a far more experienced Grand Prix driver. But this is his first time as a team leader. No wonder the pit lanes are always so crowded. Every French race has too many gendarmes. Dan Gurney and Denny Hume were looking thoughtful by their Brabhams. Mike Spence was waiting for the off. The Ferrari team were ready. And the French Prime Minister, Monsieur Pompidou, together with his finance minister, were guests of honor at the circuit. They were greeted with the usual Gallic mixture of cheers and boos. The Honda RA272 was a semi-monocoque car with a transversely mounted V12 engine carried in a tubular space frame. The engine was now claimed to be developing 240 horsepower at 11,000 RPM. At Clermont, the team were experimenting with unequal length induction trumpets to try to spread the torque range. Monsieur Pompidou was introduced to the drivers. The Walker cars used Colotti gearboxes, as Rob's ex-chief mechanic Al Francis was now in partnership with gearbox maker Colotti. As ever, Rob and his wife Betty kept meticulous records of lap times, the circuit, temperature and barometer readings. Heine Marder, the chief mechanic on Joe Siffert's car, was telling Seppi to look after his car. The front row consisted of Clark, Siffert, Stewart and Bandini. Second row, Surtees and Gurney. Hume, Ginther and Chris Amon on the third row. The total field was 18 cars. Rob knew it would be 3.5 long minutes before his car would complete the first lap. At the end of which, as expected, Clark led, followed by Bandini, Stewart, Gurney and Surtees, with Siffert dropping back. On lap 2, Clark already had a healthy lead. Behind him, Jackie Stewart had nipped past Lorenzo Bandini, and he now had Gurney and Surtees close behind him. Joe Bonnier was going well, lying 8th and lapping steadily, followed by his teammate, Joe Siffert, who had not had a good start. Jimmy Clark was driving one of his greatest races and pulling out a comfortable lead. There is no doubt that this wonderful circuit near Clermont-Ferrand suits Jimmy Clark's smooth and effortless style. He was followed by Jackie Stewart in the BRM, also driving very smoothly and making a name for himself. Bandini in the flat 12 Ferrari had been pushed down to 5th by Surtees and Gurney. Joe Siffert, with some smoke from the right-hand side exhaust explaining his earlier problems, was leading Graham Hill, who himself was having clutch difficulties and was in any case still not comfortable after his practice accident. Jimmy Clark continued on his winning way. The track surface was fine, but the earth at the side of the road kept getting thrown onto the circuit. Jackie Stewart lapped Bob Anderson's Brabham. World champion John Surtees was in 3rd and nursing a sick engine. Joe Bonnier also had engine trouble and had to let Mike Spence through. Graham Hill struggled on, now with engine difficulties to add to his clutch trouble. Denny Hume in the Works Brabham had worked his way up to 4th place. Jimmy Clark, at his very best, is always a delight to watch, and he made most of the other drivers look untidy. Famous photographer Louis Clementaski positioned himself above the circuit for that special shot. Stewart, too, looked very neat. He was now just 20 seconds behind the leader, but a long way ahead of Surtees in 3rd. The Ferrari team had been urging Lorenzo Bandini on, telling him to speed up and catch Hume in his 4th place. Joe Bonnier had to retire when his generator belt failed. Clark now led by over 30 seconds from Stewart, still followed by Surtees and Hume. Bandini's attempt to catch Hume ended when he crashed into a bank, 3 laps from the end of the race. Jimmy Clark won. His brilliance had again made victory look so easy. During the previous 2 months, he had won at Indianapolis, Crystal Palace, Spa, and now Clermont-Ferrand. Joe Sifford had finally finished 6th and was now telling Rob Walker how his goggles had kept steaming up. Somewhere in the mass of photographers and officials and gendarmes, Jim Clark made his way forward to receive his cup and his garland from Monsieur Pompidou. Clark, after all, had won from pole position and set the fastest lap at 90.6 miles per hour at this wonderful Clermont-Ferrand circuit. In contrast to the wonderful swoops and curves of the Auvergne circuit in central France, we were back at Silverstone in flat Northamptonshire for the Aston Martin Owners Club race meeting. The St John Horsfall Trophy is held every year in memory of Jock Horsfall, killed at Silverstone in 1949. It's a certain favourite meeting to which I go every year. As ever, the paddock was a happy hunting ground, with, amongst other machinery, Aston Martins of every vintage, most of them in wonderful condition. '62 EMU, the famous X-Works DB3S car, is now very well known at Aston Club meetings. As the ever-efficient club timekeepers looked on, clerk of the course Dudley Coram cheerfully set off to tour the circuit in the brand new DB5 on loan from the factory. By the end of 1965, this model was universally known as the Bond car. Aston Club Vice Chairman Ralph Perry was deputy clerk of the course. Wilfred Lloyd and Jim Burchell were delighted that for once the weather was fine. The race organisation of the Aston Martin Owners Club is known to be excellent, and this year proved no exception. George Taylor was Chief Flag Marshal. There was not much of a spectator turnout, but this was to be expected at a club event where the emphasis is on the drivers and on their enjoyment. The first event was a high-speed regularity trial, when it is important to be both fast and consistent. During the event's half-hour time span, everyone has to do a specific number of laps and at the same time enjoy themselves. Clearly someone had been doing a roaring trade in Dunlop blue overalls. Whilst the others were out on the circuit, Darrell Burton and his assistant from the Bentley Drivers Club relaxed. The Project Series cars were built in order to get Aston back to Le Mans. The long, smooth body with a rear spoiler had been tested in a wind tunnel and made the car extremely quick down Mulsanne Straight. The AC Cobras look a little brutish for my taste. Richard Bond's ex-Peter Sutcliffe lightweight E-Type Jaguar. And Arthur Cook's splendid Regio had that home-built look. The Bentley drivers had brought along some tremendous machinery, but the meeting caters for all classes, right down to the smallest minis. Bob King's Lotus 21 now sported a 2.5-litre Coventry Climax engine, just the thing to have been competitive in the Intercontinental Formula of 3 years earlier. For some reason, one of the paddock Bentleys sported an Aston Martin-style EMU number. With the meeting now well underway, Dudley Coram was asking the on-treasurer how he felt the income side was coming along. The first proper race was the sports and GT cars under 1600cc. Crocker's 1.5-litre Lotus 7 stalled on the grid. And so when George Taylor waved the flag, all the other cars had to avoid Crocker. Eventually, he got underway in this rare, independently suspended Lotus 7. John Scott Davis and Brian Field, both in the pretty little Lotus 23s, immediately forged a lead. Arthur Cook's Regio circulated some distance behind them. Starting his last lap, Scott Davis nipped inside a pretty little Lotus Elan. And Julie won at 83.6 miles an hour, with Field not far behind him. George Taylor, who'd been left so badly at the start, recovered superbly to take third. In the paddock, the start line marshals were sorting out the grid for the next race, according to their instructions from the timekeepers. The Formula Libre race featured a splendid and diverse selection of cars. On the front row, occasional Grand Prix driver Jackie Epstein's Brabham Ford, with a Cooper, and Bob King's 2.5-litre Lotus 21. Further down the grid, a Lotus 23 had a Cobra alongside, which looked a little strange, and John Sparrow's Maserati 250F was beautiful. As expected, the 2.5-litre Lotus disappeared into the distance, with Jackie Epstein leading the chasing pack. Having pulled out a good lead, King's Lotus was forced to retire on lap 9, handing victory to Jackie Epstein's Brabham with its twin-cam Ford motor at an average of 86 miles an hour. We then drove out to the wide open spaces of Beckett's Corner to watch the Britax Trophy saloon car race. It was a busy affair with hordes of BMC and Ford machinery. Commentator Leggett kept the stands informed of the scrap between the 1650 Anglias of Banks and Peacock as they remained locked in battle for lap after lap. Victory went to Banks's Yellow Anglia at just over an average of 80 miles an hour. Next, it was the turn of the big sports and GT cars in the Monte Cristo Cigars Trophy Race. It featured Cobra, Cooper Monaco with a Buick V8 engine, E-Types, several DB Astons, a Marcos, and even an XK120. Several drivers failed to keep it on the island. Most unfortunate was Eva, who crashed heavily at Maggots, driving Bob Owens's DB3S. Eva was transferred to hospital with head injuries, and the Aston was sadly written off. The eventual winner was young Richard Bond in the lightweight E-Type. Granville Smith's AC Cobra was second, and Harvey Bailey's XK120 third. The clerk of the weather continued to do his bit as preparations were made for the main race of the day, the St. John Horsfall Trophy Race for vintage and venerable Aston Martins. As in previous years, this is a handicap race with starting times based on the experience of the driver and the past performance of his car. Dudley, as clerk of the course, gave all the drivers a very full briefing. Basically, if you don't obey the rules and do what Sir says, you're in trouble. Each row of starters was set on its way by the chief timekeeper. The circuit soon had a good cover of vintage Astons, spread equally around it. Scratchman John Freeman, in the famous Spa Special, as every year, had a big task ahead of him to catch everyone else in only 10 laps. Derek Edwards was trying very hard in the 1925 Coram GP car. number 108, Gore's 1934 Le Mans car, was the eventual winner. Retter's International was second, and Glidden's Le Mans third. John Freeman took fastest lap in the Spa Special, as expected, even if he couldn't catch the leaders. With the winner's laurels duly placed around the driver's neck, the historic Horsfall Trophy had a home for another year. Perhaps the unsung hero was the secretary of the meeting, Neil Eason Gibson, who had managed to cope with all those little problems that inevitably occur at such an event. Between races, Harry Wallace, Ralph Perry, Neville Janyan and Peter Engelbart passed the time. The last Aston race of the day was for the Arthur Bryant Trophy, which is for David Brown Astons only. This produced as elegant and immaculate a grid as you could wish for. Again, a briefing from Sir. Such chats are a necessary chore for the drivers, even if not all of them are paying a great deal of attention. With a front row of DB3Ss and DBR1 Astons, an exciting race was in prospect. The field got cleanly away. The race would have been even more competitive if the non-starters had been there. Unfortunately, Tom Rose and David Scales in DB4 GTs and David Eva and Tony Oldworth in DB3Ss had been non-starters. From the grid, David Ham had led away in the DBR1, and try as they might, neither Clive Aston, Jeff Rutter, nor Ken Yates in their X-Works DB3S cars could stop him pulling away. Many spectators must have thought back just 6 short years ago this weekend, when the same DBR1 was winning the Nürburgring 1,000 kilometers, driven by Sterling Moss. And David Ham, an extremely competent driver, was taking no prisoners as he came through the back markers, forcing one of the DB2s wide out and onto the grass. Brian Jocelyn, racing his production DB3S for the first time, was the only driver to beat the system and improve on his handicap, and thus he took the Arthur Bryant Trophy. Second was Campbell in his DB2, and third Freer in his DB2-4 Mark III. David Ham won extremely impressively on the road. With the day nearly over, the senior club officials gathered to discuss how they could do it even better next year. Brian Jocelyn was photographed with the Arthur Bryant Trophy. He was anxious to be off home to his typewriter to write up his own victory and the rest of the meeting for Autosport magazine. Later that summer, the Aston Martin Owners Club organised their second race meeting of the year at Silverstone, the Martini International Trophy. This meeting gets bigger and better every year, and in 1965 it attracted several of the world's top drivers in a variety of sports cars. The full Grand Prix circuit was in use this time. Team Lotus had entered a Lotus Cortina for Sir John Whitmore to drive in the touring car race. Whitmore had been winning touring car races with this Lotus as far away as Brno in Czechoslovakia. And there was to be a historic single-seater race with a Maserati 250F, a Bugatti Type 37 with, unlike the Type 35, a four-cylinder engine and wire wheels. Aston still manages to retain a nice club atmosphere at the Martini Trophy. Derek Edwards and Bob Fowler shared a joke with friends. Roger Nathan's Brabham Oldsmobile was entered in the over 2-litre class of the Martini Trophy race, the so-called Big Bangers. He would be competing against Chris Amon, driving Bruce McLaren's own McLaren Elva. Bruce was to have raced the car himself, but had suffered painful burns in Friday's practice when a union on one of the carburetors broke loose and was heavily bandaged, although working on the car in the paddock. In the old days, there was only Dunlop at race meetings. Now we saw that there was competition from other manufacturers. The curtain raiser was the Elwell Smith Trophy race for vintage Aston Martins. John Freeman in the Spa Special, as seen earlier at the Horsefall meeting, emerged the winner in the 2-litre category. Then at midday came the Formula Libre scratch race. The field was divided into two sections, modern and historic. Tony Lanfranchi, at the wheel of a 2.5-litre Lotus Climax, convincingly won this Libre race from Dennis O'Sullivan's Formula 2 Brabham and Peter Sadler's 1600cc Lotus 32. In the historic section, Ian Seavright's Ferrari held off Richard Burgle's 250F Maserati. Dudley Coram was again clerk of the course, and we went out with him on a tour of inspection of the circuit. The long, empty stretch of the Hangar Straight would not seem nearly so long and empty in a racing car during the Martini Trophy. The main supporting event was a saloon car race, featuring the 4.7-litre Ford Mustang of Roy Pierpoint. and it was Pierpoint who led as they came to Beckett's for the first time, well ahead of the Lotus Cortina of Gentleman Jack Sears, who'd been substituted for Sir John Whitmore. Goodwin's Ford Anglia had already been overwhelmed by a horde of minis. Next time around, Pierpoint's lead had extended over the two Cortinas, and the tyre-smoking minis were led by occasional Grand Prix driver Jack Lewis. Next time around, Lewis overdid it at Beckett's, but nevertheless went on to win the class. The Mini drivers that day included the Lancastrian tuning wizard Harry Ratcliffe. And so Pierpoint powered on to win in Ford of America's new People's Sports Car, a groundbreaking design initiated by the rising star of Detroit, Lee Iacocca. And one of Mr. Iacocca's employees now is John Wyer, the former Aston Martin race manager, who was here also to watch the big race of the day, the 150-mile Martini Trophy race. Star of the race was undoubtedly reigning world champion John Surtees in his Lola Chevrolet T70. He was lapping the tail enders after only 3 laps. Mike DeUdy in his Porsche 904 was leading the 2-litre class. At the beginning of 1965, Eugen Boehringer had used one of these cars, amazingly fitted with road tyres, to finish second on the snowy Monte Carlo rally. Chris Amon in the Works McLaren Elva moved into second place, having started from the back of the grid. Being a last-minute replacement, of course, he hadn't been allowed to practice. Roy Pike in the checkered flag 4.7-litre Shelby American Cobra was leading the GT class, ahead of Jack Sears's similar car. Then, as Bowley Pittard from South Africa made his way down Hanger Straight in the elegant Alpha TZ, news came through that Surtees had abandoned ship in the hayfield, and Amon was now leading in the McLaren. It may have been a major international sports car meeting, but Silverstone is still a working farm. And up past those buildings came Mould's lightweight E-Type ahead of Jack Sears' Shelby Cobra, now leading Pike's Cobra, and Keith St. John's giant-killing little Elva BMW. I trudged back to Woodcote Corner to watch the end of the race. Before his retirement, John Surtees had set a new outright lap speed record of over 115 miles an hour. The flag fell on a popular winner in Chris Amon, a wonderful balm for Bruce McLaren's burns. Second was Peter Revson in a 2-litre Brabham BT8 Climax, finishing ahead of David Piper's 250 LM Ferrari. Chris Amon stepped forward to receive his garland from Mrs. Covington of Martini. Followed by Mike DeUdy, who won the 2-litre GT class and finished 8th overall. The fine-looking Mark 1A is the first product from McLaren's new team. How long, I wonder, will it be before they start building Grand Prix cars?